This video tutorial is brought to you by TipSquirrel at www.tipsquirrel.com. For all kinds of Photoshop and Lightroom goodness, follow at TipSquirrel on Twitter or facebook.com/tipsquirrel. Hello everybody, Mike Hoffman here, bringing you more in our continuing series of Photoshop CS6 3D goodness. And today we're working on the second half of a two-part tutorial. If you missed the first half, check the website for a link to the original tutorial, or look here at the address shown at the bottom of your screen. In this week's conclusion, we're going to be working on the materials for this wine glass and the wine it contains, adding some transparency, some reflections, and working on the shadows just a little bit. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is work on the glass itself. So we'll start by clicking the 3D layer to make it active. And within the 3D layer, if we look at the 3D panel here, recall that we have one section of meshes associated with the glass and another section associated with the wine. So we'll start by focusing on the glass. And last time we created this glass with a simple 50% gray material, and then we brought the opacity down to 18% in order to give it somewhat of a transparent view so that we could see the wine. Recall that it originally looked like this. But this week we're going to take the entire set of materials by clicking the first material and then shift clicking to select all 5 materials that make up this glass, and we're going to change the properties using the materials picker here in the properties panel. If we click the arrow to drop down this list, we can see a few materials that are included by default within Photoshop. None of these look very much like glass. But we'll move this over just a little bit, and if we click this gear right here to bring up the flyout menu, we can select default for Raytrace, which is another set of materials that is included with Photoshop CS6. We'll select that, and we'll just ask Photoshop to replace all the current materials with the new materials. Now we have some Raytrace materials here, and right here on the second row we see crystal glass. So let's give that a try. By selecting this material, it's now applied to all 5 of these meshes. And right away we can see that our wine glass is much more transparent. At the bottom of the Properties panel, we have a button that allows us to do a quick render, and we'll click that and let it run for a few minutes. Once we do, we can see that the wine glass is looking pretty nice, although it is just a little bit too transparent. If we add a background texture, and here I have some wood grain to simulate a table, we can see that the wine glass is so transparent that it almost doesn't even show up. So what we'll do with these same 5 materials selected is we'll just bump up the opacity a bit. From 2%, we'll take it up to about 12%. And now we're starting to see a ghostly outline of the wine glass. Let's go ahead and try rendering one more time and see what we get. And now we're starting to get a little more of a hint of the glass on the table. So I think we'll leave it at that. One thing we'll want to do perhaps is bump the reflection up to a higher amount, and that will be something that will work well for us, especially if we add other 3D objects into the scene or into the background. We'll see them reflecting more strongly off of the wine glass. Let's focus now on the wine itself. Recall that we created the wine simply from a texture and what we'll do now is we'll use another one of the built-in materials, in this case gemstone ruby, and we'll see what this does for our wine. Now that's interesting, but it's a little bit too bright. So let's open the diffuse color and take it down about 3 stops. And we'll open up the ambient color and take that one down about 3 stops as well. Now we've got a darker red color, and we'll probably want to increase the opacity just a little bit. Now we've got something working there. Let's go ahead and give this a quick render and see what it looks like. And that's starting to look pretty good. Let's go ahead and work on adding a reflection here in the table. And in order to do that, we're going to want to move our glass back a little bit on the table, in a manner of speaking. So what we'll do is we'll select the scene and then activate the Move tool. And with the Move tool active, we'll make sure that we've clicked on the background to select it. And we'll switch to the tool to slide the 3D object. And then we'll slide it back into the scene. Now at this point we also may want to drag it upwards just a little bit to get it so that the top is above the level of the table. But now we've got an area that it looks like we may be able to get a reflection. So how do we create a reflection? We can make use of the ground plane, and what we'll do is we'll select the environment in the 3D panel here, and then we'll come over to the Properties panel. In the Properties panel we have the controls for the ground plane, allowing us to have shadows and reflections. But we can see that the reflection has an opacity of 0%. So what we're going to want to do is just to increase that opacity, and we'll take it up to about 60%. And with a 60% opacity on the reflection in the ground plane, we'll go ahead and select the scene once more, switch to the hand tool so that we can see the entire scene, and we'll do a quick render and see if we get a reflection. Sure enough, after rendering for just a few seconds, we can see a reflection showing up here, and that reflection once again is governed by this setting when the environment is selected in the 3D panel and we change the opacity here in the Properties panel. Finally, let's work on this shadow. The shadow is a little too well defined, and we'd like to soften that up a bit. So what we'll do is we'll select this infinite light, and the infinite light is what is creating this shadow. We'll activate the Move tool again, and with the Move tool we can see that we can change the direction of that light and its corresponding shadow. However, what we want to do is make the shadow softer. So we'll just click here in the softness setting for the shadow of this light, and we'll change it to about 15% and see how that does. Again, we'll click the hand tool so that we hide all of the extras there, and we'll click on Render and see how it looks. And that's looking much softer. We'll move this out of the way a little bit so you can see, and we've really softened up the edge of the shadows there. So we've got a shadow being cast, we've got a reflection in the tabletop, and we've got our wine glass. And if we were to make one last change, it would probably be to darken up that wine a little bit more, and we can do that by increasing the value for the opacity so it's not quite so transparent. We'll make one more change here to the illumination just to darken that up a bit and see if that will create more depth in the color of our wine. And then we'll go ahead and render again, hopefully for the final time. And that's looking much better. Now the full render could take minutes or even hours depending on the system and depending on the size and complexity of this 3D model. But I think we've got it to a point where it's looking pretty good. So we're going to leave it at that. So what have we done in today's lesson? We've looked at the properties of the materials. We've seen how shine and reflection can create a reflectivity on the object and how opacity can make it translucent. We also looked at the environment itself and how we can use the ground plane to add reflections that look very photorealistic. And finally, we've looked at slight modifications to lights to add softness to the shadows to make the images more photorealistic. In the next section next week, we'll continue looking at materials properties and lights and continue developing more and more capabilities that will help us to establish a very photorealistic 3D representation within Photoshop CS6. My name is Mike Hoffman. My website is hoffmanartdesign.com. You'll find a variety of photography, Photoshop, and Lightroom tutorials and related information there. Or you can follow me at mhoffman2001 on Twitter, and you can find me on Google Plus by simply going to g+mikehoffman.com. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial.